Oh, come on, guys. That was a golf clap. Let's do it. Let's give them a real round of applause. All right. So we're going to have a question and answer period until 3:45. So these are my rules. This is my room. I'm the moderator. Everything that you say must be phrased in the form of a question, just like Jeopardy. If you have a statement or a sermon, we're going to move on. So just contact him, raise your hand, he'll come by, and you guys will get taken care of. So there's a lot of people. We will get to as many as possible. Hurry, Tim.
Having seen those presentations on the social cost of carbon, how can we incorporate this component of it, since it's clearly not been measured in there, to get a real reflection of what I would call the social benefit of carbon use, carbon fuels?
Well, I'll speak just to the only thing I can think of that came to my mind is I know the EPA has somewhere a figure for the value of a human life, right? So you'd have to figure out, how many lives are lost by some of these wars and how many would be saved if the climate warmed by a certain degree and so forth. That'd be the only way that I know of that you could get an actual dollar value attached to promote a social benefit from the warming.
I'm puzzled.
I think we're working on the when you look at EPA reform and what some of our previous speakers have alluded to, I think we're working on moving the model from a social cost to a social benefit. So let's all be optimistic that.
To clarify, Dennis, everything you guys said here shows that everything that you said shows that carbon dioxide has been a benefit in terms of stability and food production and all that, and yet those components seem to be absent from these calculations we saw. And I'm just saying that we got to get the ledger right here. And my question was, what are some ideas, or how can we move this discussion in that direction, really?
Well, I think Representative Lamar Smith was just talking about bad science. I believe Pat Michaels made a reference to it's the sensitivity and what's the other discount rate. So I think getting that science right and is the best way to go about that. And just let's get that on the public, and hopefully the truth will prevail.
Well, and let's recall that the last administration was dedicated to creating problems where there were none. And we're going to pull back from that as quickly as we humanly can.
Right. There were no grants covering this aspect of the debate under Obama. So if you change it, it's going to take a change at the top and a new directive.
Next question. Yeah, so when the next person's asking, you just let Tim know that you want the next question, so that way he can kind of make his way over there.
Raise your hands while they're asking the questions. That way I know to come to you.
Yep.
Hi, I'm Francis Menton of Manhattan Contrarian website. I was expecting you guys to address, but you didn't, an aspect of the current situation, which is that the great expansion of availability of fossil fuels recently and the drop in the price has had a huge effect on world peace by putting the bad guys out of business, like Russia, Iran, and Venezuela, all dependent on high fossil fuel prices and now broke. Russia's cutting its defense budget by 25% right now. Can any of you address some of those current issues and how availability of cheap fossil fuels affects the immediate environment?
Well, as a former State Department analyst, I can only agree that you've made your point very effectively. And the cheap is always, when the food is cheap, people can eat. When the energy is cheap, they can go beyond eating.
This question is for Dennis Avery, and that is your experience with Fred putting a book about global warming and all of the bad things that aren't happening, your own experience with agronomy and farm kinds of things, wouldn't that make you a good candidate for giving us a booklet or a book on your experience with what things really happen when you're trying to grow food?
I'm not sure that's my book. I've suddenly become a climate historian rather than agronomist.
My question's for Aaron. I'm Clint Laird with Cesar Rodney Institute. This is tangential to your topic, but you mentioned or identified alternative fuels in your presentation. Are you aware of any problems the military has had using alternative fuels?
Yeah, I remember in the research, not off the top of my head. I know I've come across problems with wind and solar, just in terms of grid reliability. I mean, they're I can't say anything off.
We can talk afterwards, but in April of 2012 at Oceana Air Force Naval Air Base, a jet took off, had a double flame out, and crashed, which is highly unusual. And the speculation was given to me by a pilot that they were using alternative fuels. And I tried my best to find out through political contacts and never got an answer to what fuel was in the plane. Might want to research that.
Yeah, and I know I've heard that ethanol is really hard. The higher level of ethanol blend, the worse it is on engines. So that lends proof to that.
I'd worry more about the availability and the cost of the alternative fuels. One of the fuels that was being used by the Green Fleet was camel oil, a small amount of which is grown in Montana. Now, when are you going to fight this war, and how much camel oil will you have in storage?
What's camel oil?
It's a crop.
Okay.
I think it's Middle Eastern.
You talked about northern mid-latitude wars. I'm wondering about more equatorial in terms of drought and effects on climate on Egypt, on the Aztec Incas.
I can speak to the Aztec Incas and the South Sea Islands in particular. The problem for the Central Americas is not temperature change in a little ice age, but drought. And the droughts extend for centuries. And the Mayans, for example, had droughts at 400 BC, massive droughts between 800 and 900 BC, and more century-long droughts at 1400. And in the South Sea Islands, those idyllic islands got a whole lot less idyllic when the temperature dropped a full degree and the sea level in the lagoons fell 3 feet, ruining the fishing, and the coconut and breadfruit crops were ruined. And instead of those airy beach houses and the songs in the evening, they were up on the hillsides grubbing out a meager existence, growing taro roots, and then living in hill forts or caves where they could protect what little food store they had. It was tough. And it was warlike. I've got some lovely, I didn't use my Hawaiian war pictures, but they're pretty violent.
Rick Sanders from 21st Century Science and Technology. I'm kind of surprised. You're all kind of, the atmosphere is kind of pessimistic because it all sounds like a zero-sum game. Nobody mentions nuclear energy, which is fantastic. We've got so many so much reserves. There's thorium, uranium, nuclear fusion coming up, and everybody's saying, well, what about this, what about that? Cut the world population to 3 billion. I mean, come on, we should keep expanding our population. We've got planets to populate and so forth.
You're fighting the demographic trend. People, when they have low death rates in their children, say, hey, 2 is fine.
Well, if we should have 3, and that will keep us expanding. In any case, but if we don't go to Kraft Erica, who brought us to the moon, he said he wrote a book called The Territorial Imperative. We have an imperative to go to the moon and go to space because we will have fixed technology. We'll run into limits with fixed technologies. But if we go to space, we'll keep growing. There are no limits to growth, just like somebody said here. That is correct. But you're all kind of talking like we're in a fixed system and we're stuck. And that's why I say we go to the future. We're going to nuclear energy. We're going nuclear fusion. That is the future. And we've got to catch up. Obama was an idiot, and he stopped us in that. But, you know, China's cranking out nuclear plants like sausages, and so are the Russians.
This system is anything but stagnant. But the frontier is no longer a riverbank or a mountain range. The frontier is knowledge. And if the Chinese are extending our knowledge peacefully, that's good. And if not so peacefully, then we have to get the military in a position to cope with that.
When 3 Mile Island went, right, we had, what, about 106 nuclear plants? We have under 100 now. That doesn't make any sense. And since you folks are good at pointing out...
Of course it doesn't make any sense, but it's the public's will. And I've spent 40 years trying to influence the public's will, and you can see how much success I've had.
The public takes...
I fought against organic farming, and I'm fighting against greenhouse alarmism.
The public takes the cue from the media, and thank God Donald Trump's starting to ignore them.
All right, next question. In the back.
Yeah, Steve Allen, Capital Research Center. This was addressed tangentially, talking about the decision makers making bad decisions based on a belief in something that's not true regarding the threat of climate change to cause all these security problems. Related to that is that you have an ideology that swept the world, and in Europe, in Germany, if you learn French, you learn that by repeating phrases like how that the West has destroyed the earth and the poor people of the world are suffering because of it and things like this. So this has been spreading around the world. It's part of Al-Qaeda's ideology, is that the evil capitalists have destroyed the planet. And then you have the Paris Treaty that institutionalizes that says to the poor people of the world, you're poor because the wealthier countries have destroyed the environment, and now we're going to give you a little bit, but we're going to give this money to like your dictators and your kleptocrats, and then you're just going to sit there and you're going to starve. You're going to go without electricity. You're going to use coal and wood burning stoves and get lung cancer and all those things because we're going to keep most of our stuff, but we'll give your dictator a little bit of that money in return for it. So does anyone address the fact that this ideology has I think the power to destabilize, to radicalize people, to promote terrorism, and so forth?
Well, that's why I was talking about free trade. And I'm also talking about free financial flows. And there was speculation this morning. They talked about the access to affluence from the West originally and gradually spreading. And 2 billion people raised from abject poverty within the last 40 years, and even hope that Africa will share in that opportunity increasingly in the future. I've been to Africa. The kleptocratic governments are in full sway. But that change will have to come from within the countries. We already tried colonialism and it didn't work. And now we're trying free markets and we hope they will.
Anybody else?
All right. Yeah, I guess we'll wrap it up. Everybody, you got a 15-minute break before the next panel starts, so enjoy it. And we will see you back here at 3:45.